A woman is shot dead behind the wheel of her own boyfriend's Jeep. She had nothing to do with any of it. She just drove him there. He had gone to that block on Chicago's west side because someone promised to give him back a gun. That promise was the trap. Both of them died inside that vehicle in January of 2018, and the man who set it up wasn't even the one holding the weapon that killed them. The man who actually controlled that weapon, every weapon like it, every gun on every block his organization touched, wasn't even at the scene. His name was Donald Lee. Chicago's West Side knew him as Lil Dom. For 20 years, no one in his organization was allowed to pull a trigger without his permission because every single firearm belonged to him personally, and if he didn't hand it to you, you didn't get to kill anyone. Federal prosecutors would eventually connect his organization to at least 19 murders and 19 more attempted murders. He personally pulled the trigger on 3 of them. He armed the men who pulled the trigger on the rest. In 2022, a jury found him guilty, and the law required a mandatory life sentence, no parole, no appeal, no way out ever. He was supposed to die in a federal prison cell. Then, 3 years later, almost all of it came undone, not because he was innocent, but because of 5 emails the prosecutors who convicted him tried to keep buried. This is how a man built an empire out of pure control over who gets to hold a gun, and how the exact same weapons that made him untouchable for 2 decades nearly weren't enough to keep him locked away for good. To understand how a man ends up controlling every firearm inside an entire criminal organization, you have to go back to a single afternoon on Chicago's West Side in the summer of the year 2000, on a stretch of Austin where a street fight had broken out between 2 rival crews. Fistfights like that one were common in that neighborhood in those years, the kind of violence that flared up, burned out, and disappeared without ever making it into a headline or a police report anyone outside the block would ever read. What made this particular fight different wasn't the fight itself. It was who showed up armed. A teenager, somewhere around 17 or 18 years old, had been a member of a faction calling itself Wicked Town for less than a month. He had a gun. Nobody else on that street did. And in the span of about a second, the entire physics of that confrontation changed. A fist fight is, in its own violent way, a kind of negotiation between roughly equal bodies, fists, size, numbers. A gun ends that negotiation instantly, permanently, and on terms only one side gets to set. When the shooting started, men who had been throwing punches at each other seconds earlier were suddenly running in the same direction, away from the same threat. One of them, a young man named Lamont, didn't make it. He was shot in the back while running after the fight had already been won, after there was no longer any tactical reason left to keep firing. Investigators recovered 6 shell casings from that scene, all from the same weapon. Federal prosecutors would later describe, in language that reads almost gently for what it actually documents, that the young man who died that day became what they called collateral damage in a dispute over roughly $10 worth of heroin. A human life ended over an amount of money that wouldn't cover a fast food meal for 2 people. And in the federal record, built decades later, that killing gets entered not as a tragedy in isolation, but as the starting point of a career, because that's exactly what it turned out to be. The gun hadn't bought that teenager entry into Wicked Town. He was already a member. What it bought him was something far more valuable inside that world, standing. Recognition, the kind of reputation that, on a street where violence functioned as currency, moved faster and mattered more than almost anything else. His name was Donald Lee. In a few years, the neighborhood would come to know him by a different name entirely, a street name that would eventually appear in federal indictments, in wiretap transcripts, in the testimony of men who had once called him a friend, before they were forced to call him something closer to a warden. On that July afternoon, he wasn't anybody's boss. He was just the only person on a violent block who had understood something none of the men throwing punches around him had yet figured out, that everything about a confrontation changes the instant one side is armed and the other isn't. He would spend the next 20 years of his life making absolutely certain that the armed side was always, without exception, him. The second killing came 2.5 years later, and by then, everything about how Donald Lee operated had already changed. The first death had happened in the chaos of a street fight he simply happened to be armed for. The second was something else entirely, an operation planned and executed with intent. In December of 2002, Lee decided that a man had to be answered for over a dispute, the details of which barely mattered next to what happened as a result. He didn't go alone. He assembled a group, climbed into an SUV with several other members, and went looking for his target, armed and organized rather than reacting in the heat of a street confrontation. They found the man they were looking for riding in the passenger seat of another vehicle. According to testimony given years later at Lee's own federal trial, he fired the first burst of gunfire as their SUV pulled alongside. But the man who died that afternoon wasn't the intended target sitting in the passenger seat. It was the driver, a man who reportedly had nothing to do with the underlying dispute at all, killed simply because he happened to be behind the wheel of a car carrying the wrong passenger on. Wrong afternoon, when 4 armed men pulled up beside him with a single name in mind and very little concern for anyone else who might be sitting in that vehicle. Hold on to that detail, the target riding in the passenger seat, the driver dying instead, because it is going to happen again on a different Chicago street, involving a different set of names. 15 years later, and by then the pattern will feel less like a coincidence and more like a signature. The third killing is the one that actually made Donald Lee's name inside that world, and it's also the one the historical record still argues over. In June of 2003, the leader of a rival organization, a faction of the Four Corner Hustlers, reportedly came alone to settle a dispute between the two groups. According to testimony given by a Wicked Town associate years afterward, this rival leader stood in front of roughly 5 members of Lee's organization, with a weapon visibly tucked into his waistband. What happened next depends entirely on whose account you believe. According to the witness whose testimony the government relied on most heavily, Lee drew his own weapon and fired first. The defense fought that account with real ammunition of their own. The same witness had, on an earlier occasion, given a different version in which the rival leader fired first, and another witness separately described a man matching that rival's description opening fire before anyone else moved. A meeting that had reportedly been called specifically to prevent further killing ended instead with 5 men on one side and 1 man on the other, and 2 mutually exclusive stories about whose hand moved first. The jury that eventually heard this case, nearly 2 decades later, believed the government's version. And what that killing bought Donald Lee wasn't a title handed to him on the spot. Court testimony places his actual rise to leadership of Wicked Town somewhere around 2004 or 2005, a year or more after that shooting. Killing the rival leader didn't hand him an organization. It made the organization notice him. Recognition came first, the way it almost always does in that world. The position came after. Federal prosecutors would eventually compress those 3 years, from a chaotic street fight in 2000 to a contested shooting in 2003, into a single sentence delivered to a jury 19 years later, a sentence that reads less like an indictment and more like an obituary written by an actuary. Lee rose through the ranks by murdering 3 people in a span of 3 years. It is blunt because it has to be. A man who shoots his way to the top of a criminal organization inherits a problem the instant he arrives there, and it's the exact same problem that got him there in the first place. If violence with a firearm is what makes a man powerful inside an organization like Wicked Town, then every single member underneath him who is also holding a weapon becomes, whether he intends it or not, a potential replacement. What Donald Lee did to solve that problem is the thing that eventually turned a violent young man from a specific Chicago block into something closer to an institution. Every account of how Wicked Town actually operated begins with the same handful of rules, and on the surface, they sound almost like an ordinary code of conduct. A list of things members were forbidden to do: never lose a Wicked Town gun, never sell one, never talk to law enforcement under any circumstance for any reason. But one member who lived under those rules for years and eventually testified about them under oath phrased the first rule differently than most people would expect, and that difference reveals the entire architecture of the organization. Lee, according to this testimony, controlled every single gun. Not members weren't allowed to lose guns. He controlled all of them. That's not a prohibition. That's a total allocation of power, and everything about how the organization functioned downstream from that single fact. If one man controls every weapon, that man controls, on any given day, exactly who inside the organization is even capable of violence. A member who wanted to shoot someone didn't need permission in some abstract, philosophical sense. He needed an actual functioning firearm, and every functioning firearm in that organization belonged to Donald Lee. The request went up the chain, the weapon came down, only then did the shooting happen. Every single act of violence connected to Wicked Town had to pass through one man's hands before it could pass through anyone else's, and that wasn't an accident of how things developed. That was the entire structure, built on purpose to run exactly that way. Wicked Town operated with two halves that fed off the same shared infrastructure: the people who sold narcotics and the people whose job was violence, a role that reportedly carried its own internal name inside the organization: shooter, defend the territory, answer the threats. Trap houses scattered across a set of blocks on the west side stored the narcotics and the firearms together in the same rooms, which tells you everything about how closely intertwined those two halves actually were. They were never really separate businesses. The drugs generated the money. The guns protected the drugs. And the one man who decided which weapon ended up in which hand decided, in the most literal and practical sense, who kept breathing on those blocks and who didn't. Federal court records eventually described Donald Lee's actual role inside the organization using three simple verbs: he supplied the guns, he made the rules, and he enforced them. In a recorded phone call from April of 2019, Lee can be heard explaining the underlying logic of the rule directly to another member. You don't ever sell one of the guns that can save one of the guy's life. Listen carefully to how he frames it. Not as an arsenal, not as a killing apparatus, as protection. In his own telling, every weapon he controlled existed to keep the people underneath him alive. A fleet of guardian objects held in common, watched over by one man for the good of everyone. That is a remarkable way to describe a collection of firearms federal prosecutors would eventually connect to at least 19 murders and 19 additional attempted murders. Go back now to that SUV from December of 2002 and to the member who, according to later testimony, told Lee afterward that his own weapon had jammed during the shooting. It hadn't. That member simply hadn't wanted to kill the people inside the car they were pursuing. He had a fully functioning weapon in his hand. He was inside the vehicle when the shooting started. He made a choice in that moment, and then he lied about the choice afterward, because telling the truth wasn't something a man in his position could safely say out loud. The government would later spell out precisely what that lie had been protecting him from. Testimony indicated that defying a direct order from Lee could get a member beaten or worse. Consider what has to be true inside an organization for a lie like that to become necessary. The fear inside that vehicle in December of 2002 wasn't fear of the police. It wasn't even fear of the rival crew they were actively shooting at. It was fear of Donald Lee, who at that exact moment held no formal title inside the organization whatsoever. He was still roughly 2 years away from actually running Wicked Town. He had one killing behind him and was in the middle of committing a second. And that alone was already enough to make a grown, armed man riding alongside his own crew invent a mechanical excuse rather than admit out loud that he had chosen not to pull a trigger, which tells you something important about the order these events actually happened in. Donald Lee didn't become frightening because he eventually became the organization's leader. He became the leader because he was already frightening well before he held the position. The formal rules arrived afterward, and they were instantly enforceable the day they were written down, because everyone underneath him had already spent years learning exactly what it cost to tell that particular man no. Once one man controls every weapon inside an organization, something else changes just as fundamentally. He no longer needs to be physically present for violence to happen in his name. In 2015, a man was shot by a Wicked Town member using a weapon that, according to that member's own later testimony, Lee had personally pulled from one of the organization's trap houses on North Lawndale and placed directly into his hand, fully aware of exactly what it was going to be used for. Lee's defense attorneys attacked that testimony aggressively, and they had legitimate grounds to do so. The witness was cooperating with the government under a formal deal, exactly the kind of arrangement a defense team is trained to dismantle in front of a jury. The jury believed him anyway. But notice what has to happen for federal investigators to reach a man like Donald Lee at all in a case like this. Someone who is physically present in the room has to be willing to say so, out loud under oath in a courtroom, with that same man sitting across from them. That same year, another man was killed, and prosecutors would later tell a jury that Lee had directed the murder personally. But the clearest possible illustration of how this entire machine actually operated in practice comes from December of 2017. Two members came to Donald Lee because they intended to find a specific man, and they needed a weapon to do it. Lee didn't go with them. He didn't have to. He directed another member to hand over a firearm that belonged to him. The intended target was killed. Roughly 3 weeks later, an entirely different man was shot to death on the west side, and when investigators ran ballistics on the recovered shell casings, the results matched the exact same weapon. A single gun, released by one man for one specific killing, that then kept moving forward into a second killing its owner, may never have explicitly ordered at all, because a firearm released into that kind of organization didn't come back afterward and sit quietly in a drawer somewhere. It stayed in active circulation, in the hands of men who had already used it successfully once and had no particular reason to stop. Donald Lee's total authority over the weapons made him legally answerable for what they did the very first time they were used. What they did after that first use was simply the system he had built running forward on its own accumulated momentum. And that momentum, whether he fully understood it or not, was the entire point of building the system in the first place. Which brings the story back around to a January night in 2018 on Arlington Street on Chicago's west side, and to a piece of this particular killing that hadn't yet been explained. A man had been lured to that block on the promise that someone owed him a gun and some money, and the promise was that the weapon was waiting there for him. The man who arranged the meeting was reportedly wrong about something, He had convinced himself, without real evidence, that his target had been talking to law enforcement, and he acted on that belief with complete misplaced confidence. Being wrong about it changed absolutely nothing about what happened next. A federal complaint filed the following year lays out exactly how the lure worked. A debt over a firearm and some cash, and a story specific enough, the gun waiting on that block to bring the target to a precise address at an hour someone else had chosen for him. Firearms functioned as the actual currency of standing inside that organization, which meant a debt involving one was a debt worth collecting in person. A gun brought a man to the exact place where a gun ended his life. His girlfriend had driven him there in his own Jeep. She had nothing to do with any of it. She died behind the wheel when the shooting started, a Mercury sedan. A December afternoon 15 years earlier, the target riding in the passenger seat. The driver who had nothing to do with the dispute at all, the one who actually died. The exact same arrangement, repeating itself at opposite ends of Donald Lee's 20 years running that organization. The person the guns were actually aimed at sitting beside the driver, and the driver paying the price instead. Across those 2 decades, Wicked Town was connected to far more killings than Donald Lee would ever personally answer for in a courtroom. 6 of them are the ones he would eventually admit some role in. 3 he committed with his own hands, and 3 he armed, supplying the weapon that carried out a killing he himself never pulled the trigger for. A federal court filing would eventually summarize the entire pattern in a single phrase, that Lee ruled with an iron fist and fostered a culture of killing, breeding younger members into killers in his own image. Underneath that phrase sit 6 specific men, 6 funerals, and at least 1 weapon that kept moving between different shooters for weeks, after it had already done what it was originally borrowed to do. For roughly 15 years, Donald Lee used his absolute control over every firearm in Wicked Town to see his entire organization clearly from the inside. Nobody moved without a weapon, and no weapon moved without passing through him first, which meant that at virtually any given hour, he knew exactly who was armed, who owed him something, and who was likely about to do something violent. What eventually took that exact same visibility, the movement of guns through his organization, and turned it into the mechanism of his downfall, was some coordinated federal task force that set out from day one to bring him down specifically. That part of the story tends to get lost in every retelling. Nobody in Chicago law enforcement woke up one morning and decided this was the year they were finally going to take down Wicked Town's leadership. What actually happened is that Chicago police began working a relatively minor set of narcotics cases in late 2016. The kind of street-level investigation a city that size produces by the hundreds every year, and the kind that almost always closes right around where it started, without ever leading anywhere larger. Federal agents joined as the investigation widened through 2017, and somewhere in that process, they began doing the one thing that transforms a pile of disconnected street crimes into something else entirely. They started matching the guns. Shell casings recovered from one shooting were compared against casings recovered from a completely separate shooting. Firearms seized during unrelated arrests were traced backward through their entire documented histories. Surveillance, wiretaps, phones seized one at a time, each one cracking open a little more of the picture. Individually, each piece of evidence represented a single violent night on a single block, exactly the kind of case that closes unsolved and stays that way forever in most cities. Assembled together, they formed a map, and the map had an unmistakable shape. That shape was an entire organization. Take a single weapon as an example, the 9mm handgun used to kill the man and his girlfriend on Arlington Street. That exact gun had already surfaced roughly 2 weeks earlier in a completely separate shooting. It hadn't appeared out of nowhere for that specific murder. And its story didn't end there either. The day after that double killing, one of the men involved bought a used sedan with $900 in cash, drove it to Minneapolis, traded the 9mm for a different firearm entirely, and came home without it. The logic behind the move was straightforward enough on its face. Put 400 miles between the murder weapon and the bodies, and trade it for something with no history attached to him. Personally, the original gun eventually turned up in Milwaukee in a completely different man's hands, and investigators found it there. Moving the weapon to erase one connection ended up creating an entirely new one, a fully documented journey out of one city, through a trade in a second city, into a recovery in a third, with every single leg of that journey representing a fact that could be laid out plainly in front of a jury. The exact quality that made these weapons so useful to Wicked Town in the first place, the fact that they circulated constantly between members, is precisely what turned every single one of them into a witness that could never be threatened into silence, and they circulated relentlessly. Investigators eventually identified a single firearm that passed between multiple Wicked Town members and was used in 4 or 5 entirely separate shootings within a span of roughly 2 weeks. That isn't an arsenal in any conventional sense of the word. That's infrastructure, a shared tool, checked out, used, returned, and checked out again by a rotating workforce, except the actual work being performed was killing people. Donald Lee was arrested in June of 2020. By that point, he already knew his phones had been tapped for months. He knew what federal agents had been listening to, and he still refused to tell them anything at all. The rule he had enforced for 2 decades held right up to the very end, well past the point where it was still protecting anything meaningful. On November 1st, 2021, a federal racketeering indictment was formally unsealed, charging 13 alleged leaders, members, and associates of Wicked Town. 11 of them looked at the sheer volume of evidence the government had assembled and pleaded guilty before a trial ever began. 2 chose to fight it out in a courtroom, Donald Lee, and another member described by prosecutors as one of the organization's active shooters. By the time the investigation fully closed, federal agents had seized 46 firearms, roughly 1,000 rounds of ammunition, 17 kilograms of cocaine, 7 kilograms of heroin, and additional quantities of crack cocaine, 46 guns taken out of the hands of a man who had spent 15 years making absolutely certain that every single one of them stayed exclusively in his. Opening statements began on September 26, 2022. The trial itself ran for roughly 2 months, and more than 100 witnesses took the stand over the course of it. Prosecutors handed the jury their entire theory of the case in 5 words. Wicked Town's specialty was violence. Proving those 5 words in a courtroom required 2 completely different categories of evidence, and the gap between them is exactly why this story doesn't end cleanly with a conviction. Physical evidence established what had actually happened. Ballistics tied specific weapons to specific bodies. Shell casings linked one shooting to another across years and neighborhoods. Recovered firearms carried their documented histories along with them. Surveillance and phone records placed specific people in specific places at specific times, and crime scene photographs showed the jury in unavoidable detail exactly what a firearm does to a human body at close range. All of it was undeniable in the most literal possible sense. An object cannot take the witness stand and change its story under cross-examination. But an object also cannot explain who gave the order to use it. A shell casing can prove that a gun was fired on a particular corner. It cannot testify that a man across the city authorized the weapon that fired it, or that the organization operated under a rule specifically requiring that authorization, or that refusing that man was dangerous enough that grown men invented mechanical excuses rather than risk saying no to his face. Only the people who had actually lived inside Wicked Town could say any of that out loud, so the government put them on the stand, one after another. A cooperating witness walked the jury through exactly how the organization had formed and how it evolved across 2 decades. Another cooperator gave testimony the government itself would later describe as potentially decisive in convincing the jury that Lee had personally directed one specific murder. The member who had once handed over Lee's own weapon for a killing described doing exactly that. And the man who had once lied about a jammed gun to avoid shooting someone in 2002 sat in a federal courtroom 20 years later and explained the entire structure of the organization's rules out loud under oath in the one room where telling the truth actually counted against the man he had spent 2 decades being afraid of. In October of that year, the jury was shown crime scene video and photographs from Arlington Street. Some jurors reportedly didn't look away. They studied the images closely and took detailed notes. They also heard a recorded account of that same night, one of the men involved calmly narrating a double murder to someone he apparently didn't realize wasn't law enforcement, with no idea that recording would eventually be played back in a federal courtroom in front of 12 strangers, deciding whether he and his associates would spend the rest of their lives in prison. On November 15, 2022, the jury convicted Donald Lee of racketeering, conspiracy, firearms charges, and drug charges. They found that he had personally committed 3 murders and had personally supplied the firearms used in 3 additional killings. His co-defendant was convicted separately of 1 murder and 3 attempted murders, and Lee's verdict carried with it a number nobody in that room was allowed to argue about, negotiate, or appeal for leniency on. Life, not a maximum sentence, a judge could weigh against mitigating circumstances and potentially reduce. A mandatory term written directly into federal statute years before any of these specific people had ever walked into that courtroom, already settling the question in advance. There was nothing left for a judge to do but read the number out loud. 20. 2 years after a teenager turned out to be the only person on a violent Chicago street carrying a loaded gun, it was, by every reasonable measure, finally over. Except it wasn't. 2 years after a conviction that was supposed to guarantee Donald Lee would die inside a federal prison, something happened that 20 years of guns, violence, and total control had never once produced for him a chance. It arrived, of all things, as paperwork. While federal prosecutors were preparing to sentence the man who had lured the January 2018 double murder victims to their deaths on Arlington Street, they disclosed an email. It had been written in May of 2022, before Lee's trial had even begun, by one of the assistant U.S. attorneys handling the case, and it conveyed a specific sentencing expectation for one of the government's own cooperating witnesses, a witness who had gone on to testify directly against Lee. That expectation had never been disclosed to Lee's defense team. A judge, once alerted, ordered the government to go back and search for more. They found 4 additional emails involving 4 more cooperating witnesses, each one attached to some version of an undisclosed expectation that had never made its way to the defense before trial. 5 cooperators in total, out of the government's entire case. To understand why 5 emails could genuinely threaten a case built on 46 seized firearms and mountains of physical evidence, you have to remember exactly what the prosecution had told that original jury about those specific witnesses. These were, by the government's own description, admitted killers and drug dealers testifying in exchange for consideration at their own future sentencings, and prosecutors had met that obvious credibility problem head on at trial, arguing the jury should trust these witnesses precisely because their formal cooperation agreements obligated them to tell the truth, and because the actual Terms of those agreements were fully available for the defense to examine and the jury to weigh for itself. Except it turned out, some of the terms weren't actually sitting there in plain view after all. A federal judge concluded that these undisclosed benefits had undermined the very foundation the government had asked that jury to build its verdict on. In an order signed in the summer of 2025, he called it an extraordinary case and granted Donald Lee something almost nobody convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to mandatory life ever receives. A new trial. None of the physical evidence had moved an inch in the meantime. The 46 guns were still sitting in an evidence locker. The ballistics results still matched exactly what they had always matched. The photographs still showed precisely what they had always shown. But the layer of testimony connecting all of that physical evidence specifically, personally, legally to Donald Lee, the men who could actually explain under oath, who controlled those weapons and why, had now been compromised by the government's own undisclosed conduct. And without that human layer, the guns proved a great deal about what Wicked Town had done as an organization, and considerably less about who, specifically, had been standing at the top of it. Giving the orders, as the case moved toward a possible retrial, federal prosecutors briefly raised the possibility of seeking the death penalty, citing a policy shift at the federal level. Lee's defense called it exactly what it looked like: vindictive prosecution, retaliation dressed up as procedure. Within weeks, prosecutors backed off that threat entirely. In the end, what actually moved Donald Lee toward resolving his own case wasn't the shadow of execution. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic had turned genuinely uncomfortable for both sides at once. Evidence deteriorates with time. Cooperating witnesses who had already testified once might refuse to do it again, and now each of them carried a documented, provable weakness that any competent defense attorney would go straight at in a second trial. The government was staring down a real possibility of losing a case it had spent years and enormous resources building from a pile of unconnected street shootings into a fully assembled federal racketeering prosecution. In September of 2025, Donald Lee pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy. He formally admitted his role in 6 murders and surrendered most of his right to appeal in exchange for a sentence with an actual, negotiated endpoint rather than the automatic mandatory life a jury had already handed him once. The single rule he had enforced without exception for 20 years, never talk to law enforcement, had held all the way to the very end of his fight against conviction, and in the final accounting, it hadn't come close to saving him. It was 5 buried emails between prosecutors and their own witnesses, not 2 decades of silence sworn under threat of violence, that gave him back the one thing his own organization had never once been able to offer anyone underneath him: a second chance. At sentencing, a federal judge handed down 34 years, the maximum his plea agreement allowed. Donald Lee is in his 40s now. He will be close to 70 years old by the time that sentence runs its course, if it runs its course at all. His co-defendant received 20 years. Before handing down the number, the judge addressed a warning directly at whoever might, decades from now, someday be asked to consider shortening that sentence, referencing a separate, unrelated Chicago clemency case that had made headlines that same month. A reminder, he said, that a pardon in a case like this one might once have sounded laughable, but no longer sounded entirely unimaginable in the world as it currently exists. He told them, whoever they eventually turn out to be, to look at the crime scene photographs first. Lee's own attorney had made her case for mercy in exactly 10 words. He is not a monster. He is a human being. Both of those statements can be true at exactly the same time, and the distance between them is where this entire story actually lies. Because the weapons made him, they gave a 17-year-old standing on a street where nobody else was armed. They gave him a name at a peace meeting that ended in gunfire instead of peace. They gave him an entire organization once he worked out that controlling every gun meant controlling every single person who might ever need one, which, inside that world, meant controlling everyone. And then those same weapons, moving in constant circulation between shooters he could never fully account for, built themselves into a ballistics map detailed enough that total strangers, working from the outside, were eventually able to reconstruct his entire organization, one recovered shell casing at a time. The men who could read that map for a jury delivered a verdict meant to keep him locked away permanently. And then, almost impossibly, nearly all of it came apart in his hands, not because the guns lied, not because the bodies weren't real, but because the very people prosecuting him had cut corners nobody was supposed to know about. The photographs are the one part of this story that no email, no undisclosed deal, and no retrial could ever undo. They outlived the verdict they helped produce in the first place, and a federal judge has already told everyone who comes after him exactly what to do the next time someone asks whether Donald Lee has suffered enough. Take a look.